So tonight is a very special Friday night. Not only is it Friday night, which is just, regular Shabbat, but it's also the eve of another holiday, Christmas Eve. And I thought, what better topic to bring up than ways in which Judaism and Christianity can and have in the past learned from each other. More specifically and kind of selfishly, ways and conversations that I've learned from my Christian colleagues and things that I perceive that I've brought to them. Because it's an interesting time, I think, that there's in the intersection of both of these holidays. And I also believe that the fact that these holidays are coinciding gives us the time to remind ourselves that we do have a lot in common and we can learn from one each other, more importantly. So one of the very first things that I learned happened to me right after I was ordained. I was in my synagogue in Huntsville, Alabama, and embarrassingly enough, we were having this interfaith pilgrimage coming on through into the temple. So there were clergy from all sorts of congregations throughout North Alabama, and they came to worship with us. And I remember one of them said, can you talk about pilgrimage holidays? And I sat there and I literally looked very confused. And I didn't understand until the Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Jeffrey Ballin, stood up and said, Rabbi Bahar, they're asking you about the Shalosh HaRegilim, the 3 pilgrimage holidays, which I never heard it referred to in the way that they were referring to it as. And so my brain didn't quite connect. And then as I have had more and more interactions, I realized they were very knowledgeable about the Bible, at least the Christian pastors that I interacted with, specifically about prophetic literature. And so I made it a life's goal to become invested expert in the Bible and in prophetic literature, and which has led to many in-depth, wonderful conversations about what is the Messiah. How do you know somebody's the Messiah? How do you know who a prophet is? How do you know somebody is a real prophet? And all of those wonderful conversations led me to have a deeper understanding both of the Jewish Bible, but also look at the Christian Bible a little bit more differently. It gave me an understanding and a desire to learn about translation theory and how we choose words that have our implicit bias within them into the translation itself, thereby having slightly different biblical understandings and readings of nearly identical text. Another thing that I found fascinating with my Christian colleagues was an understanding of original sin and sin in general, and where does it come from and what does it mean. And of course in Judaism we don't necessarily have this concept of original sin or falling out of the Garden of Eden. That's just not something we have. But what it did force me to do was come up with an understanding that I could easily use the English language and metaphor to communicate sin, not just with my congregation, but in multiple interfaith settings, so that we can truly understand what is sin, what does it mean that we don't have original sin, what does it mean that one of our focuses in Judaism that we are inherently good, whereas original sin implies that there's something wrong from the very beginning. So already we're setting up some sort of a dynamic that includes and describes things that aren't necessarily the same. Does that mean that one religion is correct and one is not? I don't believe so. But what I believe is that for me, especially as a Jew, I want to focus on the good in everybody, and I want to highlight that. And getting rid of the doctrine of original sin allows me to do that much more easily than my Christian colleagues can. The other thing that I found fascinating was the argument. I don't want to call it argument as in people were screaming at each other, but the multiple conversations that I've had regarding belief and faith, emunah, in Judaism. And we all know that in Judaism, you don't necessarily even have to believe in God to be an amazingly good, wonderful Jew. You just have to follow the commandments. You have to engage and live a Jewish life. And for Christians, there's this belief component, which is almost first, and then everything else comes subsequent to it. And it's forced me to really understand, where is belief in Judaism? How can we expand Judaism to incorporate more spirituality? And recognize that for many people, that is a necessary component of their religious faith. Just doing doesn't hit everything that is part of their entity, but there are components of being and believing which are inherent that I learned from my Christian colleagues. And I believe that in those dialogues with me, they learned and were challenged by the idea that you have to believe something in order to do it. One of the things that I think of as a gift in Judaism is, to be honest with you, sitting and going into somebody's shiva house is not always the most fun call, visiting somebody after they've lost their loved one. Sometimes we just don't feel like it. In Judaism, there is that big push to do, go visit, go do. And once you finally get there, you'll realize, oh, maybe I am glad that I went. What a good thing. And so that's also led to interesting conversations about, what does it mean that we are a religion of practice, a religion that engages and does, versus something that is just about belief. And one last thing that I think has also helped me in many interfaith conversations is not just about sin, it's not just about the Messiah, it's not just about the Bible, it's not just about belief, but also in how do we interact and have the conversation of who's in the faith versus who's out of the faith, and what are those boundaries and what do they look like. And so in those conversations of being inclusive and warm and welcoming, that has also led, I think, and further been enriched by my interactions with Christian clergy. When I've asked them and talked to them about issues on civil rights and LGBTQI plus rights and inclusion, and really come to understandings about inclusivity. And so I'm able to learn from them, and they're able to learn from me, and collectively we're able to, I think, watch and have our faiths further enriched. I will tell you that by having and taking opportunities to go and pray in different houses of worship, one of the biggest, and this is my last final lesson of takeaways, is that, wow, we do that same thing just a little differently. Or I see it, I have that same experience in my own house of worship just a little differently. And when I see those differences, it makes me understand how ritual has evolved all the way from the Second Temple period through today, what the church held on to, what the the synagogue have held on to, and then also what mosques and the Islamic faith has grabbed onto and gravitated toward. And by doing so and seeing all of the different rituals, I'm able to, I think, understand even more clearly how to construct a service, how to bring ritual in, and how to make meaning out of everything. So I think for me at least, the fact that Friday night, Christmas Eve, all coinciding, has just been this wonderful gift of a reminder of wanting me to continue to have interfaith dialogues, of learning from my colleagues in different religions, and ultimately enhancing my own faith through those interactions. So may this year be an inspired year to force in the bad way, but encourage us and propel us in the good way to have more conversations, more dialogue, more positive interactions, so that we can learn and be our highest selves. Kenny Hiratzon, may this be God's will.